Okay, so this one is going to be mainly on Chapter 5, but strongly on, on Key Issue 2, a little bit of 3, and a little bit of 4. These are the ones we kind of went over in class, a very generalized view of all the different aspects of language here. Um, so the first thing we're going to look at, these are definitely, again, terms you need to know: official language, used for government to conducting business, publish documents, everything they do in their daily life, literary tradition, system of written communication. So if you have your communication written down, whether it's a logogram, okay, or an alphabet, it's literary tradition. Monolingual would mean a country has one official language, and then bilingual or multilingual, you're going to have more than one official language, so you're going to have two or more official languages. So before we move on, I would strongly recommend checking out this video. This was a 5-minute video we saw in class down on Blackboard 9. That should be there for you. It gives you a good overview of systematically how language evolved kind of from families, then eventually into even different dialects. Kind of moving on here, we're going to start looking at the 4 major branches of the Indo-European language family. The first one we're going to look at is Indo-Iranian. In right here should give you a very strong clue that it's going to be in India. This is usually used in South Asia. Again, they are subdivided then between Indic and Iranian. Okay, remember, Indi is going to be in the east, Iranian is going to be more on the west. Second one we're going to look at is the Romance branch here. This evolved from Latin roughly 2,000 years ago, Vulgar Latin. So keep in mind the Roman Empire had this entire area here. And then within the Roman Empire, you had this idea of Vulgar Latin. So they're supposed to be speaking Latin, but since they were isolated, they're all further apart. Okay, they all had kind of their different version of Latin. This became Vulgar Latin. So Spanish, Portuguese, French, all emerged from Vulgar Latin. When the Roman Empire broke down, all these areas started creating their own nations, own states, and then they kind of incorporated the type of Latin that they were speaking in their own areas, thus creating Spanish, Portuguese, and French. Next one we're going to look at here is the Indo-European languages of the Balto-Slavic. This one's going to be a little bit harder for us to kind of regionalize a little bit, but if you think about the Baltic states, the Slavic states, okay, over here, this pink, purple thing over here is going to give us kind of a good idea. So the big language here in the Balto-Slavic is going to obviously be Russian. Keep in mind, Russian, or this language family, would have spread a lot further during the time of the Soviet Union, because they really tried to enforce everyone to speak that. Remember, that was like a centripetal force that they wanted everybody to speak Russian in these areas. But now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, a lot of these places are going back to their native languages. Thus, Russian is a little more restricted than it previously was. And now we're going to kind of get to a main one here is the Germanic branch, which is eventually going to lead us to English here. So English, Scandinavian, German, Dutch, these are all part of the Germanic branch. So how did English kind of get to eventually to England? So we're going to take this back a little bit ways. So remember, English is part of the Germanic branch, which is part of the Indo-European family, if you will. So essentially this is going to be kind of part of the roots over here of the Indo-European, which is eventually going to eventually lead us to England here. So one hypothesis of how these type of speakers got to modern day Central Europe, which then eventually invaded England, is the nomadic warrior hypothesis. This is going to be by Maria Gimpuchides. I'm not 100% sure on how to say that name, but kind of associate this hypothesis with the nomadic warrior. So when you think warrior, you're thinking the war hypothesis. This is because this was spread largely because you had these Kyrgyzs here who originally were from Russia, present-day Kazakhstan, who slowly moved over into the European continent, mainly because they had domesticated horses and they needed to continue to feed these horses. Thus, they needed more and more land to kind of let these horses roam, to feed them, to continue to have this as part of their culture tradition, that they needed to finally evolve, roam, grab more land. Therefore, to get more land, they had to go to war. So this is the warrior hypothesis, which is associated with horses because horses, one, help them in war, and two, that's kind of the reason they went to war, is to grab more land for their horses throughout the year. So obviously this is going to be a slow progression here. It's not going to happen overnight. Now the other hypothesis, if one is war, the other is going to be peace here. So the sedentary farmer hypothesis, this is the peaceful one. These are farmers. This is a little more to do with agriculture. So the Anatolians, okay, started here in present-day Turkey, and the belief is they moved slowly east and more west. We're more interested in kind of the western migration. But if you see here, notice that it is skipping the Arabian Peninsula and slowly moving there over towards India, which is also speaks Hindu, which is going to be an Indo-European language as well. So this belief, Colin Renfrew has this hypothesis that you have these farmers at the time and their ideas are really good. Okay, they're able to produce a lot of crops, vegetables, and the people next to them want to know how they're doing it. So to communicate this, they're going to be using their language. Now these people know how to farm. Well, these people over here do not. So they have to learn how to farm. They're going to be asking these people how to farm, and slowly, okay, it's not that these people are moving over, okay, to kind of spread it. It's that it's simply spreading from one person to another to another. So this is more of the agricultural theory, the more peaceful theory, that the present-day Indo-European family, which leads us to English, evolved more from agriculture rather than war. Regardless of the hypothesis, these people all spread out and were isolated, and eventually you started having your own versions of the language that they originally spoke, which is going to lead us to Latin and other modern offshoots of that, including the Germanic branches, which is going to give us English. Now that we kind of have the Indo-European family, if you will, kind of moving on to the main part of continent of Europe, how do we kind of get actually English from that? Couple ideas is you have these Germanic tribes from the mainland here of Europe that are slowly going to invade England. At the time, you have the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons, which are all going to invade this area. The different parts that they invade are also going to kind of play a role into the different dialects that they even have today. So they're going to simply combine with the people that are already there, and it's going to slowly kind of blend together to kind of create a little more modern day English, if you will, or something closer that we're used to. So, excuse me. So when these three invaders blended, it eventually became known as the Anglo-Saxon culture, which that culture and that blend of languages then kind of becomes English. Now their English was not the same as present-day English today, because English has evolved throughout the years. So keep that in mind. Not the same, not the exact same English. So over time, one of the reasons it's not the same is now you have the Vikings and the Normans, who also then invade England at different points in times. So now English is now changing even more because they have their influence brought there. This just kind of shows that English hasn't been the same language for the last 1,000 years. It's always evolving. So for the next thing here, so how did the Normans kind of play into this? When the Normans came, they brought kind of their official language of French over to England. So now you're taking some French words, you're embedding it into English, and now it is slowly kind of emerging into the present day English that we know today. So we have this video here we watched in class, How Did English Evolve? I have it posted on Blackboard 9. If you just want a general summary of how English has evolved, it's a good video for you to check out. So now we're going to look at the dialects and diffusion of English. So now that we have English strongly embedded into England, how does it diffuse? How do you get all these different dialects? This is roughly going to be a little bit of 5.3 and 5.4 kind of overview here. So dialects are usually regional variations of a singular language. So different parts of the country, whatever country you're in, could have different dialects of any kind of language. Over time, these dialects can slowly change, okay, and then it can kind of be its own language. But if everybody can understand each other, then it's just going to be a simple dialect. Usually this is kind of associated with the isoglass concept, the boundary of how certain words are pronounced, the certain way you say words for different things. So an isoglass, keep in mind, kind of isolated. So soda is kind of isolated to southeastern Wisconsin, whereas northern Wisconsin, you'll kind of see an artificial line being drawn there, isoglass, if you will, that now says pop. Usually this is because of relocation, kind of diffusion of how you get these different kind of dialects. England does not speak the same English as the United States, which also does not speak the same language or same kind of English as Australia. So relocation and diffusion has allowed us to spread English, okay, but now you're going to have different people moving into these different areas, and they're going to be a little more isolated from each other, or they're going to be coming from different parts of England, and that's going to kind of explain the different concepts of dialects. Okay, so in England they have three main groups kind of dialects. Again, because of the different Germanic tribes, they landed in different spots of England. You are now with that blending to get the modern day English. It's not going to be quite the same in all the different parts of England. Can they all understand each other? Yes, because they can understand each other, it's still going to be the same language. And this is very similar to the United States in that Northerners sound very different from Southerners. So dialects in English, okay, it's pretty straightforward. You have the Northern dialects, okay, it's going to be in the north, Midlands, the mid area of England, okay, and then down here you are going to have Southern dialects. So it's pretty straightforward, and again, this is largely based on the different invading tribes. Okay, if a certain tribe from Europe invaded here, okay, they're going to speak a little bit different, but because they're so relatively close, they have that very common language which became known as present-day English. So how does this kind of relate to the United States? As you can see here, we have three main distinct kind of dialects that kind of come from when we were colonized by England, and we had migration throughout the years. So are there many different dialects in the United States today? Yes, but they kind of can be broken down into these three main groups here in the United States. So the northern part, okay, the little more sophisticated kind of came from the east and southeast England. You're going to have a little more kind of the proper English, if you will, up there. The southern part, okay, came from the southeast. But from different backgrounds as the northern colonies. So these were the lower class people that were probably from London and the higher end areas. These were the working class. So they were a little more urban, but when they got here, they were definitely a little more gritty. They moved to the south mainly because of the multitude of farmland the south provided for them at the time. So that's going to explain a different dialect of English, and then this is going to also explain a different dialect of English. So the Midlands, hopefully you can kind of understand like the mid area is going to be a nice mixture, if you will. Notice how it kind of spreads out a little bit more than these are a little more regionalized. This you can kind of see it's going to be going a little bit further. The Midland areas, because these were all dominated by English settlers, now you're going to have Quakers, Scots, Irish, German, Dutch, who don't necessarily feel welcomed here. You don't have a lot of open land, and these people come a little bit later, so they're going to be moving more inland. Thus, with that mixture, okay, and all the other people that are slowly moving and relocating from these areas are going to have a different distinct version of English, a kind of combination, if you will, from these areas. So two specific dialects, if you will, that I kind of want to go over again. We have Appalachia, which is basically the mountain region, the Appalachia Valley here. A little more isolated from a lot of the rest of the country. This is a very rural area. They're going to have their distinct sound. They kind of are very prideful of this. The way they say certain words is kind of a part of their culture, which kind of keeps them together, which separates them from the little more urban and coastal areas of the United States. Ebonics, on the other hand, is going to be an African American dialect in urban areas in the United States, just not the southern portion. So think Milwaukee, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Detroit. Though both are very prideful and brings a sense of pride, it also represents kind of a social economic issue with these regions, because these regions this was very rural, and in the inner cities up here with a strong African American population, they did not get the same schooling, same education, same economic opportunities. Thus, part of the way these have evolved was because of a lack of education. Okay, so it does kind of show how socially economically challenged they were for a while, but it's also now more of a sense of unity and pride throughout their cultures. We have a real quick map of the dialects in the United States. These are nothing where you need to exactly kind of know the different terms. Just know kind of you still have that northern kind of accent, the Midland accent, okay, kind of the southern accent, and then within these little dialects, if you will, you have other specific kind of accents that sound a little bit different. When you drive to the south, you're going to hear y'all the entire time until you get to Florida here. Then southern Florida is going to be a little bit different, and kind of a reason to explain that is southern Florida also has a lot of retirees, snowbirds, if you will, people moving from the north and the Midwest and out west coming to Florida for retirement. That is one possible explanation why this part of Florida is different than, quote, the rest of the West. If you go to Georgia, their southern accent, even though they say y'all, is going to be different than the y'all you hear in Texas. The dialects in English can be broken down into two categories in the UK. So these two kind of British dialects today, you have received pronunciation. This is a little more hoity-toity, a little more proper. Government officials, actors, it's very posh, if you will. You can hear them very clearly. Again, this is received pronunciation. Cockney, on the other hand, is going to be kind of the example where you don't really understand what they're saying. They use a lot of different kind of code words that kind of mean something. When we looked at Ocean's, I believe 11 in here, they said Barney Rubble. They had no idea what Barney Rubble means. Okay, it means they're in deep trouble. It's just a different common kind of phrase. This is more of the working class East London neighborhoods. Kind of this is what influenced the Australian accent. A lot of these people in these neighborhoods eventually relocated to Australia. Thus, when you hear Australians talk, it's not the same as received pronunciation as you hear in England. So if you see an interview on TV with a government official or actor, it's going to be in the RP. Cockney is going to be a little more down, nitty-gritty, working class part of England there. So this is the video we kind of looked at, the upper class, Downton Abbey here. And then the next one we kind of looked at, again, was Ocean's 11, where that guy was kind of talking in code. Nobody had any idea what they were saying. They all spoke English. Okay, usually you can understand received pronunciation, but here in America, if you hear Cockney, you're not really going to understand it. That's kind of how different those two are. Three ways that British and American English differ. These are ones we really need to know. They differ because of vocabulary. This is usually because in America we encounter new things that they had never seen in England or in Europe before. So we have the American buffalo. Is that a buffalo? Okay, or is that a bison? Is it the same thing that we saw over in Africa before? We're not sure, so now we're going to come up with different vocabulary for it. Spelling. Part of spelling is a little more prideful, kind of unitary of the United States, to be a little more distinguished from the UK, from England, from Britain, because we did not want to be the same as them. So we're going to have our own versions of some words, some little spelling differences. So the words are the same. Same pronunciation, same understanding, okay, but the spelling's a little bit different. Now, how we pronounce our words, okay, this was mainly because we did not have mass communication then. Newspapers, periodicals were printed. You would be in New York reading something that you have no idea how this was actually supposed to be sounded out when you got that newspaper from England. And then also keep in mind the rest of the United States, they don't have telephones at this time, so you're not understanding what people are saying for all these different words. So therefore, how you say them and how you learn to say them are going to be from people around you. So if they've learned a little different version, then everybody around them is going to learn that little different version than prior. So now we're going to kind of look at, again, continue with English, how dominant it is on the worldwide stage. English is a lingua franca. It is a language of international communication for many purposes, mainly through kind of trade here. When people do business with each other, and you have a lot of Chinese businessmen coming to the United States, they usually communicate in English. Not because it's the easiest or it's the most spoken kind of everywhere. It's just simply for trade reasons. It's been heavily influenced, and therefore many different people are talking in English to try to settle trade deals. Another reason for the spread of this now for English is because of popular culture, media, internet, and the business world are all dominated by English. Once you have all these movies filmed in English, all these other places have to hear them in English unless they have translators. And even if they don't have them translated, okay, if they have subtitles, you're still hearing that English in the background. Thus, it's helping to spread. One example to kind of show kind of the dominance of English, remember, is the airline pilots around the world have to communicate using English. You can't have all these different languages in different spots, especially when you're flying over other countries. Even though that might not be your destination, you might have to check in with them. Having one universal language for that is helpful, and the one they've kind of used is English. Some of the influence of that was kind of shows the international business dominance of Britain and U.S. after World War II. Since Britain and U.S. both spoke English, they were the two big economic powers at that point. Because they're the big economic powers at the point, many of the other places in the world are now starting to then pick up English as kind of their business language, if you will. It doesn't mean it's their national language, or it does not mean that it's their official language. It just simply means that's how they're going to kind of conduct their business. So previously, lingua franca around the world was French. This was also kind of because of migration and conquest by the French, the different French colonies around the world that they settled. So French at the time, a lot of different traders and sailors around the world would speak in French to kind of communicate and convey their ideas. Today, English has grown as the global lingua franca through expansion diffusion. So everybody kind of has access to it. It goes from one place and starts there, then slowly expands, and everyone there, because they're getting the same kind of information, it's slowly expanding. So think in mind, relocation, you have to have sailors go around the world. They're not going to hit every spot. Expansion, everyone's a little more exposed to it today. So even if like Madagascar over here gets exposed to English, slowly people from there who have received that English kind of transmission are going to start to learn it. So continuing on with the dominance of English, notice that it is official language of 55 countries, by far the most different countries we have for an official language in the world. It's predominant or the de facto language here in the United States, but again, it's not the official language. Our government has just never decided to actually make that as the official language, though it's when you hear about English-speaking countries, you need to include the United States. It's just not simply an official language. All right. Also, to kind of show this, you have nearly 2 billion people live in a country where English is an official language, even though they can't speak it. So even though a lot of people in the world can't speak it, it shows the dominance of English being that lingua franca, because many different places have that as an official language. For the historical reason for this, people migrated from England with their language when colonies were established. Notice that many of these, with colonization, are English colonies. You have Canada, United States, South Africa, India, okay, a lot of small island states, New Zealand here, okay, Australia. So keep in mind, one of the reasons for their historical reason is because of colonization through the UK. Another reason why English is so dominant today, kind of the explanation of why it's so dominant, is a contemporary reason, contemporary meaning kind of current. On Wall Street, it is kind of the main business language, if you will, today, and then also Hollywood kind of spreads that. So having that idea of all these movies being produced in English, everyone wants to see these movies, even in foreign countries, and they are usually made in English. Thus, people kind of want to learn that language to truly kind of understand those movies. So continuing with the dominance of English, when English is embedded into a French language, okay, not French people coming to an English language, but with English going to a French country or a country that speaks predominantly French, okay, you're now going to start seeing these kind of English versions of these words all throughout here in a very heavily dominated French area. Same thing for Spanish. It's going to be Spanglish. So when English infiltrates into Spanish, it's going to be known as Spanglish. And then finally here, again, remember, not really funny, or not really Spanglish, but I thought this was kind of funny. And then finally here, German, you have Denglish here. So English embedding into German, okay, now going to be called Denglish. North America, we kind of have three major languages that are spoken. We have Spanish, predominantly in Mexico, Southwest United States. Then we have English, predominantly the United States and most of Canada. But then the third big language here is going to be French, which is going to be in Quebec here. It's going to be predominantly spoken. So we're going to quickly go over kind of the impact of French in North America there. So a quarter of Canada speaks French, predominantly in the Quebec province over here. Montreal, city of Quebec, predominantly speak there. This is the reason for this is because this part of Canada was settled, initially colonized by the French. So they have a lot of French culture here. They want to keep that culture. until kind of recently, Quebec was a less developed area of Canada that was kind of dominated by the English-speaking rest part of Canada. So for a long time, they kind of felt oppressed because they were a little more French. They spoke French. They had a kind of a different culture than the rest of Canada. However, they want to preserve their culture. They want to continue to speak French. They find that a huge part of their culture. So thus they're going to fight really, really hard to kind of keep that going and to ensure the rest of Canada does not impose English continuously on them. So how have they done this? How have they kind of preserved French in here? Couple reasons we might want to know. They made French mandatory in many daily activities. So you have to speak French. You doing this, this, and this. Toponyms have been changed, so it might have been an old English city or a park that has a certain toponym. Now they've changed it and made it into a different French word, or it might just be the French variation of that word. An example of stop has been replaced with arrête, even though France uses the word stop, so that's how strong Quebec wants to keep the French language that France has converted to stop, because it's a little more universal. Think about all the people that are traveling through France per day that are not actually French. But here, okay, they want everyone to continue to speak that, so they're going to stay a little more hardcore to keeping it French. They've done this also, rejected separation from the rest of Canada by a slim margin. So they still want to be kind of part of Canada, but they want to be able to preserve their culture. Today, Quebec is a little more linguistically mixed, as you can see kind of here. Not all of Quebec is heavily dominated by French, but for the most part, a lot of people here are going to know English, but they want to preserve their French language as their first and foremost language in this area. So now what threatens this? So before we looked at what preserved it, now we're going to look at what kind of threatens them. A lot of neighborhoods have become more diverse because of migration and people moving into the area, and they want to kind of use English because English is going to be more beneficial to them throughout the world. It's a little more universalizing language. French, on the other hand, they feel they're only going to use to this area, so if they move here for an opportunity, they don't really feel they need to learn French. So now a third of all English speakers have married French speakers in recent years, so now you kind of have that blending. What language are we going to speak? What language are we not going to speak? And again, migration, especially from Latin America, Europe, and Asia, they've always probably known their number one official language that they grew up with. English being probably number two, because I knew that was going to be very beneficial to them, especially in the rest of the world. Now they're coming to Quebec, and now they're like, do we have to have a third language? Do we have to know French? We'd rather not. We don't think it's beneficial to us. So now Quebec is kind of facing these challenges because you have a lot of people in Quebec who are being discriminated because they don't want to learn French. They don't want to fully embed into the French culture.